The United States stores hundreds of millions of gallons of crude oil in a series of salt caves along the Gulf Coast. It's just one of the many things that we store in caves. This is the Strategic Oil Reserve, and it's used to insulate us from the wild price swings that come during times of crises and chaos. In 2009, this system of caverns held around 726 million barrels, but just this week it's dipped below 300 million barrels, which is a level we haven't seen since 1983. While the idea for the Strategic Oil Reserve has been around since the 1940s, it wasn't actually created until the Arab oil embargoes in the early 70s, when the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries refused to send oil to the United States because we supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. History doesn't repeat, but it does often rhyme. Under President Gerald Ford, who was not elected to that position by the people of this country, gas prices more than tripled and lines for the pump could span miles, and America plunged feet first into a recession. The government purchased the salt caverns in April 1977, and by July 1977, the first storage complex was being filled. Salt is naturally impermeable, so they were chosen because it would theoretically keep the crude oil from leaking out. And they chose the Gulf Coast due to its proximity to refineries and pipelines. Again, it's crude oil, so it hasn't been refined for things like diesel or for use in cars or for industrial plants or whatever. It's supposed to be able to reach the market within 13 days of the president saying, do it. We fill up the reserve just by buying oil on the open market using appropriated funds or money from proceeds from previous sales. Then they inject the oil by pumping seawater into the caverns to displace the oil upwards. When they want to get the oil out, they inject seawater into the bottom of the cave to push the oil into the distribution pipelines. It's wild to think that the salt caves are that impermeable that we don't have mass poisoning of the groundwater around these sites. So, over the last half century, we've dipped into our reserves a few times, with the first time being during Operation Desert Storm in 1991 under George H.W. Bush. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and that interrupted supply and prices fluctuated wildly. It stabilized once the withdrawal intentions were announced, and only about 17 million barrels were sold. The next time we withdrew from the reserve was in 2005 under George W. Bush after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Katrina destroyed a lot of refineries, as well as a lot of infrastructure like roads that were needed to actually move it around, and it halted the production of oil coming out of the Gulf of Mexico. It's hard to really overstate the destruction that Katrina caused in the South. If you've driven to New Orleans at all over the past 2 decades, you can still see the scars. Like there's abandoned theme parks. It's crazy. Anyway, that was around the 30 million barrels. Obama drew from the reserve in 2011 due to the oil supply being disrupted during the Libyan civil war, and we released another 30 million barrels at that time. In 2022, Biden released 180 million in response to Russia attacking Ukraine, and the reserve was drained to levels not seen since the 80s. That administration repurchased 58 million barrels and had a deal for another 200 million before he left office, but the reserve was still in a deficit. They also lend out oil to private companies, and they're supposed to return it with interest in the form of additional barrels as interest, even though this is supposed to be used for emergencies only, which is what the current administration is doing. The current president mocked the last one for dipping into the Strategic Oil Reserve and made a point to bring up how important it was to refill the Strategic Oil Reserve during his inauguration address. And then announced on March 11th of this year that they would release 172 million barrels over the following 120 days in a loan to private companies where they're supposed to return 18 to 28% more oil than they took. This was part of a coordinated effort across 32 countries to release 400 million barrels of oil worldwide to try and stop the price shocks that would occur when we attacked Iran. These reserves were built over 50 years ago, and now they're less than half full, and the equipment is aging. There are more defects than the Department of Energy has time to address, with the DOE announcing in May that about a quarter of the reserve, over 100 million barrels, couldn't be used at all because of construction and cavern issues. There's a risk of cave collapse, and yet no plans for upgrades or corrections, and no money being allocated for this issue. If there's a major infrastructure issue, hopefully we'll have hundreds of millions of barrels of oil trapped underground that we can't access, if we're lucky. Every time we make a withdrawal, it becomes more and more fragile. The entire system is approaching its end of life. It took us 30 years to fill up our reserves, and 70% of the withdrawals from the system have happened since 2014. The United States consumes around 21 million barrels of oil a day, so if we have to just use the Strategic Oil Reserve, we only have about 2 weeks worth of backup at this point. So the strategic oil reserve is under 300 million barrels as of this week for the first time in over 40 years, and it's sitting at 43% capacity. What happens if we lose our buffer? If you want to know more about the background of the strategic oil reserve, you can check out the video before this one. You could see sudden spikes in prices, not just of gasoline, but anything that's transported. So everything. Groceries and other goods would get more expensive, and even where people would lose their jobs because businesses would have to make cuts. Travel and hospitality would slow down as normal people wouldn't be afford to road trip, much less fly. So your touristy hotspots would probably feel the crunch very quickly. Currently, we're sitting at around $80 to $85 per barrel, and some experts think that could shoot over $120 pretty quickly if we ran out, or even if we had the idea of running out. So think about how much you pay for gas and then add an additional 40% to that. The administration has been leaning on the strategic oil reserve in order to keep prices down and keep their approval ratings from tanking even further. Iran knows this. When we attacked Iran and they shut down the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation, they knew it would be a matter of time before we got desperate. The Strait of Hormuz is one of, if not the world's most critical oil shipping lane and has been shut down for months at this point. Most of the time, between 20 and 25% of the world's energy is traversing through that waterway. The oil and its related infrastructure in the surrounding countries are also at risk of attack. Blowing up 2.5 million barrels of Saudi oil would send markets into a tailspin worldwide. Iran does not want to negotiate with the United States. They don't have any respect for our leadership, same, and are waiting for someone to actually be successful or for his term to conclude naturally. They really don't want this to happen again, and they're hell-bent on embarrassing the people we have in charge in order to ruin their political careers, and they're doing a great job. People have started to notice the market manipulation, and that when the government says we're negotiating, they're selling stocks, and when they say, never mind, we're still shooting at each other, they're buying. The Department of Energy says they aren't worried about this at all, which is crazy because engineers, economists, and investors all are. Ongoing hostilities in the Strait of Hormuz have a lot of people worried, not only about the United States oil supply, but global inventory as a whole. And the effects of this are already being seen worldwide. Airlines cut flights and raised fares due to jet fuel shortages earlier in the year. The cost of diesel has exploded with increased costs for anything that moves via truck, train, ship, or uses any diesel engines in the production process. So like tractors on farms. Many countries that rely on the energy that comes from the Strait of Hormuz are rationing electricity. Morocco, which has no refining capabilities, imports over 90% of its fuel and only has a 2-month supply right now with no path forward for replenishment. China now has the largest oil reserves at around 1.4 million barrels, which dwarfs our less than 300 million. China's been importing less oil, which actually has helped insulate the rest of the world from the worst of the price swings. Once they start buying again, though, prices could go through the roof. India and South Africa have recently announced that they were working to expand their own reserves. India imports about 80% of its oil, so it's extremely exposed to political turmoil and other events that affect prices. South Africa currently only has 8 million barrels because the state illegally sold off over 10 million in 2015. Some reports are saying that if they were to see a full interruption of fuel, their economy would lose about 1 billion rand or $61 million a day. 80% of the oil that comes out of the strait is bound for Asia. Japan is wholly dependent on imports and has about 263 million barrels in reserve, while Europe as a whole has about 179 million. It's not just oil that goes through the strait. The region is also a major provider of helium, aluminum, sulfur, and ammonia, the last two of which are vital fertilizers and pertinent for food supplies. Wealthier countries are better able to weather these price jumps just by outbidding the poorer countries, meaning the more vulnerable populations are taking the brunt of the fallout. Fertilizer shortage is really the scary part. The soil is completely depleted of nutrients in a lot of areas because we've been farming for the better part of 12,000 years now. Past spring, many farmers, both in the US and abroad, had to decide whether to pay for inflated fertilizer prices or use less and risk smaller yields. The price of sulfur alone in Africa has risen over 30% since the conflict began. The fall harvest is coming up very soon, and we'll get a better idea of the impact this all had to our food supplies. India started buying urea from Egypt, Algeria, and Nigeria since they can't get it from the Middle East anymore. Speaking of Nigeria, the conflict in the Middle East has been really bad for them, with sharp hikes in the price of oil already causing economic hardships and malnutrition increasing over 30% amongst their children. They aren't even involved and are watching their children suffer because of this. Eastern African agriculture has been really affected as well. Sudan gets 50% of its fertilizer from the Strait of Hormuz, and there are very few other routes available to them. Kenya is seeing really big hits to its exports, including its cut flours, coffee, and tea, because shipments have to find alternate routes. Sri Lanka reported a 24% loss in rice after a chemical fertilizer import ban in 2021. If that's a worldwide trend, we're really in trouble. More than half of Yemen's population was already at risk of hunger before this started, and now the cost of rice has risen by a third, with many other staples spiking even higher. Food assistance programs are only able to reach 1.2 million out of the 8 million affected in that country due to funding. So, coupled with the heat waves popping off every time you turn around and the super El Nino on its way, it could get extremely expensive for everyone this fall. The UN recently put out a report saying that due to the energy crisis, ongoing conflicts, and fertilizer costs, it could push an additional 9 to 18 million more people into going hungry across this planet. Opening the strait tomorrow would not fix all these issues. There are some plans to open up a pipeline through the United Arab Emirates, or the UAE, as you probably know them, which may help the region export liquefied natural gas and oil, but that won't solve the fertilizer problems. It will probably take years to fully rebuild the destroyed infrastructure and months for the supply routes to be reestablished and for all of these resources to get to their final destinations. And we will never be able to replace the lives that have been lost along the way. It's extremely important to note that the United States and the West as a whole have been insulated from the worst of these problems that we have created, and it's likely to get much, much worse before it gets better. Right now, our government only cares that ExxonMobil and Chevron's stock prices have risen over 25% this year.